All right, so welcome everybody. This is the Exploring the Nexus Between Black Life and the Law conversation. My name is Ashlyn Crawford. I'm a 3L at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. I'm also the vice president of our Black Law Student Association, and I have the honor of moderating this conversation tonight. I'll do some quick introductions and then we'll just get into the conversation. So we have Professor Imani Perry here tonight. She is the Hughes Professor of African American Associate with the Programs in Law and Public Affairs, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Jazz Studies. She's the author of 7 books, and she has a new book out, which is really exciting, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry. Professor Perry is a scholar of law, literary and cultural studies, and an author of creative nonfiction. That is her new book. Yes, represent. Professor Perry earned her PhD in American Studies from Harvard University, her JD from Harvard Law School, and an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center. Her writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination, crafted in response to and resistance against the social and political legal realities of domination in the West. And her newest book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, was released earlier this year. And Dr. Wilson has it, he's holding it up. Speaking of Dr. Wilson, who's also a part of this conversation, Dr. Tianansi Wilson is an associate professor and the founding director at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law for the Center of the Study of Black Life and the Law. They are an award-winning scholar of law, literary and cultural studies, a racial justice strategist, and author of creative fiction. And their legal research is situated in legal philosophy, critical theory, political economy, and constitutional law. And their writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance.
Imani.
The social, political, and legal realities of Black folks. And so I'm so excited to have you both here in conversation. The first question, so the way that we're doing this is that people can put questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. Some people submitted questions beforehand, and so we'll try to get through all those. We don't have a lot of time, but I think the conversation will be great anyway. So I'm going to start with one of my questions since I have y'all here. And the conversation tonight is around exploring the nexus between Black life and the law. And my question is, what do you both consider to be a pillar of understanding that connection between Black life and the law? What is something that is foundational or what you consider one of the most important things in understanding that connection?
So I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Ashlyn. Of course, it's wonderful to be hosted by you, and it is such a delight to be with Dr. Wilson. I just have to say initially that, there's times in your life as an educator that you meet someone who you understand has a very particular kind of gift to bring to the world. And so irrespective of whether you're at the same institution or you interact with each other, that there is a responsibility that you bear. People did that for me, and I continue to do that for others. And my encounter with Dr. Wilson as a law student, I was like, even though I have left legal academia altogether, not only do I want this person to make their way into academia, but also to be the kind of expansive intellectual and scholar that it was very clear that they were already going to be from the outset. So I just want to say that. This question of the pillar, though, for me, so much of it begins with, and I wrote about this in my book, Vexy Thing, with the concept of legal personhood. That is, foundation of Anglo-American law, but European legal conceptions in general, this notion that being a human being does not mean that one is necessarily a person, just does not necessarily possess legal personhood before the law. And so from the very beginning, to be written outside of the conception of humanity as a legal matter is in some ways the foundation for all of it, right? So we talk about the history of civil rights law, we talk about the history of slavery, but to actually not be contemplated as a subject before the law is the beginning, right? And so as we have these sort of multiple generations, and it's a global matter, right? Because it's also the case as part of the colonial project, right? To like who counts before the law, who has standing, right? Is that's the precursor to any other conception, citizenship, personhood is at the core. And so if you trace that, right, sort of what it means to be a legal person and to be excluded from personhood, and then it becomes very clear why we have so much retrenchment after every period of progress, because their conceptions, and Dr. Wilson writes about this beautifully in their work. There are these conceptions that are always sort of the undercurrent that drag Black life back outside of contemplation, right? Out of being considered as part of the political community that becomes the occasion of so much violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and first, thank you for joining us. I'm so happy to see you. And for those that don't know, Imani and I met when I was a law student, as they said, but also was part of my dissertation committee and helped me survive that long, arduous process, and reminded me that it's important still to write beautifully and not just, in this kind of blunt or strange academic way, and to insert, myself into the work. And so that, I think it's one of the most important lessons that you taught me, is always be authentic, not just in yourself, but also in the way you represent the ideas and the reality of what it means to be living in Black, but also the process of dying while Black. Like, what does that begin to look like? So thank you for that. And thank you for helping me brainstorm the center and what that begins to look like years ago. But to answer the question, I think that it's also important to kind of get to what Baldwin would say is this notion of Black witnessing. You have to understand what it means to be not just a witness, but to be a good witness. And I think the kind of history of Black folks in the church speaks to that in a particular type of way. But we also know within the law, what does it mean to actually be called to the stand, right? What does it mean to kind of give a testimony that has the veracity of truth? And in law school, one of my professors always told me, she's not here right now, but my professor of evidence at Howard Law would say that remember that the law is about proof and not truth, right? But the truth itself is always singularly about truth. And so I think to begin to understand the nexus between Black life and the law, you have to begin to kind of interrogate yourself and what does it mean to be a witness and step outside of your body, while also listening to the signs and signals of your body that are kind of representative or in response to the type of traumas, terrors, and resistance and living otherwise, as Leah Hartman might say, that is constituent of Black life, right? And then to begin to kind of sit back and think about the Black interiority and begin to understand that Black logic, Black responses, Black non-responses, Black movement, and Black stillness sometimes actually have nothing to do with the social order, right? There's ability to step out and step beyond that I think sometimes we don't understand because we believe ourselves to always be in response to some type of inertia, whether that's legal, whether that's terror, whether that's socio-political, or whether it's intramural. So the ability to really kind of step back and be a true witness and to step out of all these preconceived notions that we believe about the world and actually think about how Black folks done this, not just now, but yesterday, right? In 1967, 1867, 1619, 1514. What does Blackness mean then and now? And how has it changed, right? And how has it stayed the same?
And so, Dr. Wilson, you talk about stepping back and being a witness. And Professor Perry, in your newest book, you talk about history as an instruction and how we tell a story as a choice. And so the question to both of you, I feel like kind of sentiments like, what is the story that we should be telling about how Black life and the law interact? I think sometimes we can be like not afraid, but we're hesitant to tell a certain story. So what is the story that you think that we should be telling?
Well, I'll say that I am very skeptical of single stories always, even in the moment what we have now, where there are these sort of efforts to revise the official story to be more expansive, to be so so part of the method for me in my book is to actually disrupt the conventions of the narrative form of history, and to understand that wherever you are, right, wherever you stand, right, and once you start to sort of you talk to folks, you have moments of moments of deep interaction and encounter, and then also you dig beneath the soil. How did people come to be here? Each place is a universe in a sense, right? Because what interests me most is the nature of human relation between human beings, relation between human beings and the land, and how we get towards right relation. So the idea of the kind of, and the fetishization that we have of official stories in some ways allows us to evade those questions, right? What is the ethical order that we ought to pursue? And so to me, the question, I mean, I almost, to the extent that there is a story, the story to me is that there is a Black tradition of pushing towards something closer to right relation. It's not a singular tradition. There are very different political ideologies that exist amongst Black people, just even in the United States, much less the world. But given the history, right, of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and the Enlightenment, right, that this standing outside has actually been this, I think, a moment of incredible imagination, right? It has produced an ethical imagination that I think is actually a source. It's not just a source of inspiration for people, but also it pushes us towards some truth, right? Like, what does it mean? And so part of what I write about, I write about an ancestor, Esther, it's unclear what her name is, but she was born in Maryland in 1769. Her parents were born in Maryland, right? So what does it mean to these Black people who are born and raised in this nation and witness the creation of the republic that doesn't consider them, right? That's the interesting vantage point for me, right? And then you don't get hung up. I think one of the things that we are often uncomfortable with is we're very, as Black folks, the success story narrative that feels so dishonest. Because yes, they're achieved, but we haven't, we're not there, right? But the story is not a success story. The story is actually a kind of an argument, a moral imperative, right? To change the relations in this country. That's the story to me, as opposed to have we gotten to the promised land, which clearly we haven't.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say I think about the story as a type of distilled and subdued and weaponized chaos, right? Because what happens in distillation is you take out all the parts that you deem harmful to you. They're not harmful inherently. They're harmful to you, right? And so you take those things out and then you subdue it and you make it calm. And then you tell the story in a way, generally for those that have been the victors, or in this case, the captors, or the survivors, or the preferred, or the strivers, that we're talking about the intramural Black community. And that's how we get where we are. But then I think about, to Imani's point, going back again, who I would call it maybe a queer ancestor, William Dorsey Swan. What does it mean to be born in 1860, or be 4 years old rather than 1860, being born a slave, right? And again, back to Maryland, and then to grow up and take care of your brother. But in this time, you're both Black and you're queer and you're non-binary when these things don't exist. And not only that, you're walking through the streets of Maryland in a ball gown. Right? You're hosting these balls for Black and other queer people of color, white queer folks. And when the police kind of bust into your house, you throw yourself down the stairs and you tell them, "You, sir, are no gentleman." What does that even mean, to be confronted by someone who exists outside of gender, to then check you on your inability, right, to inhabit this thing of gentleness? What does that do? What does that do to the story? And then it also begs the question, what happens when we don't know the stories of the William Dorsey Swans, right? There's this idea, even right now in this moment, that Black queer history is born at Stonewall. Right? But in reality, Black queer history has always been a contention with and among the constraints of the notion of Blackness, which in and of itself is a type of white supremacist container, right? For these Africans, right? That weren't kind of, or we put it in Shirley Chisholm language, that were unbought and unbossed in particular types of ways before the slave ship. So the story in and of itself is about a breaking, right? A breaking into pieces of a type of social order that predates coloniality, predates slavery, into bite-sized pieces that then can be consumed. right, into a national order, into a national origin story that belies us to say that in order to be a real human, which is kind of interchangeable with citizen in America, right, the United States, you have to be patriotic. But in order to be patriotic, you have to swallow the lie, right? That is this ongoing array of the unending notion, right, of slavery, right? The non-emancipation of others have called it. So I think that's what we have to really get at when we're thinking about the story, because the story is really the agreed upon lie.
The agreed upon lie. So I'm so interested in the story and the narrative that we put forward. And I think it's even a point of contention when we think about critical race theory and what that means to people and what it actually means and what it means in our realm in the legal world. So can you both discuss the importance that critical race theory not only has on the law, but on Black life? And maybe, you know, to get deeper into the story that should be told, or the story that shouldn't, like bigger narrative in our country.
I also want to come back to Swan because I think, you know, that I just think it's such, you know, what happens if, I mean, because this is an important piece of queer history, but it's also such an important, like what happens if the student encounters Swan in class alongside Douglas, alongside Tubman, alongside the Crafts, and you ask these questions about the all of their expansiveness in terms of a political imagination and around politics of gender, like you get a completely different narration of Black politics, right? Just in the mid, you know, 90s. Okay, but I'll go back to the question you asked. You know, so here's the thing that I struggle with in talking about critical race theory, because it's both the case that in this moment, critical race theory is being taken to mean anything that has to do with Black people, which is right in the public realm. So it's sort of this, but it's also the case in academia, in legal academia, but in academia at large, we have different ideas of what it ought to be and do, right? So in the field of education, critical race theory means something different than it does in law. And that even in the realm of legal academia, there is a more kind of, there are branches. I mean, there's critical race theory that is a kind of struggling with sort of liberalism and the idea of sort of color blindness, right? Colorblind constitutionalism. And this question is sort of the way the abstraction of the colorblind constitution makes it virtually impossible, if you hold on to that, to address the history of racial inequality, right? So, and it is very heavily based upon how you causes of action, right? So how do you make a claim for legal recognition of discrimination of some sort based upon various forms of identity, you know, various notions of identity, if you can acknowledge them? That's one branch of critical race theory. But there's also sort of critical race theory that is asking questions about the very structure of the nation state, about, you know, what we take for granted as a sort of jurisprudential logic, right? And so even in that realm, those are really serious political and intellectual differences. So it's so hard to have this conversation because there hasn't even, I think, for crits and critical race theorists, right, there hasn't been a kind of interrogation of the wide range of political formation or commitments that we have, right? I mean, because part of the reason I don't tend to call myself a critical race theorist is that I don't conceive of myself as being in the mainstream of critical race theory. But those who critique, you know, imperial logics and also are trying to figure out how do we use the law, notwithstanding sort of the imperial law, to reduce suffering, that, you know, I feel like I'm part of that community. But that's a rather narrow thread, actually. Do you think? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel the same way. I mean, I use, and I tell people this all the time, when it comes to theory, I'm very promiscuous, very poly. I don't really do monogamy when it comes to ideas, right? Because if you're, no offense to anyone else, but I think if you're serious about thinking, you can't just say, I am a theory. whoa, baby, slow down. Use that thing and expand to something better, bigger as you live through the world. But I tend to agree with you, this notion of critical race theory. When I think about it, I identify myself more with the criticalness of imperialism and the ways in which racialism, right, shows up, not just in the United States, but in the world, but more specifically within Black community. And to your point, I'm more interested in thinking about if the law is going to be a gun, right, at my back, in the inverse of what Harriet Tubman would talk about, what then can I do to the gun?
Right.
Right? If it's going to be here anyway,
right. Yes.
what can I do to this thing in light of this social order? Right. So in some ways, I think that critical race theory is inherently important for us, particularly in law and across a lot of disciplines, to begin to have a language to think about the critique of the law as if it's something that must be, right? And to think about the law as even having the capacity to self-correct. I think when Derek Bell gave us interest convergence, he did a very great thing. Right. And so I tend to kind of stick with that, but I think it's more of a jumping off point than a landing page for me, just to begin to kind of frame the questions and think about them, because even with the presuppositions of critical race theory, you then have to begin to think about, well, why are we dealing with law anyway? Is this a waste of time? I mean, Saidiya Hartman calls on us to begin to think about what it means to live otherwise, right? So do we sully ourselves in engaging with the law and trying to use it as a particular type of way to save or engage or do harm reduction for Black life and Black suffering, where in which our mere presence itself becomes a type of social credit card, a social capital, an affirmation of the law's utility, right? And its pure interest or pure possibilities in and of itself. So I always wonder, I'm like, ooh, do I have blood on my hands? What is going on here? Or must I grab the gun too before I get shot?
Yeah, well, I will say strongly the latter. I mean, I think, because I think there's one thing that is a sort of an intellectual exercise, but and part of this is because I come out of an organizing tradition.
Right.
You have to the imagination is excited when people are organized towards making the conditions of their lives better. And so, and I have done this plenty of times as an intellectual, like you have this assessment of what the world ought to be, but you have to deal with the conditions as they are in order to actually figure out what the imagination can do, right? So one of the things that is like my little bee in my bonnet, honestly, right now, is people who are talking about abolishing the Supreme Court. Of course, the Supreme Court is a deeply flawed institution, but we are Black people in the United States.
That's right.
If we didn't have the Supreme Court, do you know where and I don't want to fetishize the court, but there's just basic access to rights that actually make it possible for us to organize that are so it's not the end, right? Like, I'm excited about Justice Brown Jackson. That's not an end.
Right.
But, I think that there's a sort of romanticism that is only possible because people know it won't actually happen, right? About saying abolish all these things when people have to live here.
That's right. It's a simultaneity of it all, right? You can do the work of thinking about how do I deconstruct this house? Right. But while you're thinking about deconstructing, you must also be building a new home elsewhere. Right. You can't just tear your house down.
And also think about folks who are houseless.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, like to be, we're in these universities and we also are aware and we're thinking all of these, deep critical thoughts. And there are people who cannot step foot into a university to join us. And so to me, that is as if those are the people to whom I believe myself to be accountable, who I feel connected to politically, ethically. Part of the work has to be also thinking about, well, who can get into the building? That's right. And if, so there's a kind of ease with saying, oh, this building is bullshit, but I'm up in here, right? Right? Like, which I think is so often one of the things we actually have to grapple with in terms of Black left politics.
And even the ways in which, many of us, and I try my best not to do this, right, gatekeep the entry to the building. Right? We'll say we're here doing this deep liberatory thought and we're in meditation and we're thinking with the spirit and the ancestors and our grandmama name and great grandma and ancestors or whatever. But at the same time, you don't want so-and-so to come work at your campus because they believe this. Right? Or they're in contention with your work. So then in what ways do we begin to type of phenomenon, wear the mask? right?
That's right.
At the same time, while speaking out the side of our mouth, as we say, both in the Midwest, in the South, you know. So.
Yes. Or talking out the side of your neck. Both
Oh,
of them.
that.
Yes. Yeah.
So there were a few questions that people sent in before, when they registered. So I kind of want to get through these. So one of the first questions is, what can Black legal professionals do to contribute effectively to the problems facing the Black community and the law? So that's a big question. Like, none of us here have like this answer, because if we had the answer, we'd be rich and like things would be so much better. But if you could think of anything, like, what do you think Black professionals could do?
I mean, I'm going to say something that is not necessarily popular, but I really think it's true.
Say it. Say it.
Black folks need to be prosecutors.
Yeah. There you go,
Because
Ashley.
we have to disrupt because we have to disrupt the engine of incarceration. Right.
Mhm.
And that's the only way that the disrupt. I mean, I understand more often Black folks want to be PDs, but the idea of actually, I mean, and that is just an immediate crisis. There are 2 million people in prison. There's 1 million Black folks in prison. Like, there's just a fundamental, right? And so while, you know, there's some of us who are over here, like talking about abolition, there also need to be Black folks who are talking about, yeah, I'm not going to like sort of push for more arrests and more prosecutions you see. So I think that those like positions, and they're tricky, right? Like, because, and so to me, it's almost like, in the position you occupy, what does it mean to have a liberatory politic, knowing that there are no clean hands. We're all implicated in this system, right? I mean, I think, you know, and Anansi, you said it earlier, right? We're all implicated in this system in some way once we're in the position of being professional. So what does it mean to have a sort of Black liberation politic, knowing that context, right? Whatever position you occupy. It's also like when I worked at a firm, briefly, you know, that there was a pro bono case in Alabama that was about an ineffective assistance of counsel case for a Black woman who had been abused her whole life, who was on death row in Alabama. The only other woman on death row at the time was a white supremacist. That someone chose that case, right? And choosing that case had some value in terms of putting a lot of resources to the art. Now, what I have preferred, the resources have been distributed to the larger community to improve the quality of life. Everybody in that part of rural out, absolutely, right? That would be my preference politically. But it mattered that there was someone at that firm who took on that case. And so I just think we have to think about that as a practice.
Yeah. And to your point, right? And this is, you know, I think about this all the time in my head, and it's contradictory, but I think it's also necessary. I think to your point, Dr. Perry, we have to have not just Black people that are prosecutors, but Black people that are the, I would say controversial, but abolitionist prosecutors, if that can possibly be a thing. You have to walk into that courtroom knowing that the courtroom is the modern instantiation of the slave auction, right? And so is it better? And because I've read kind of cases where this happened, we actually have Black people buying people into freedom, right? So how do you begin to do this? How do you walk into this kind of auction block situation and put people into better pathways to freedom, vis-a-vis you may not have been able to do as a public defender? And you know, my background, I love PDs, that's my world. But at the same time, the public defenders are constricted, right, by the kind of power of the public defender service. And so if a prosecutor can step in and say, actually, I'm quoting these studies on trauma, right? And also how anti-Blackness in many ways also rearranges the brain with dark matter and abuse, and we know what happens there, right? And puts people in a particular type of disabled nature, right? So if we can think about that, I think that's something different that happens. But I would also say to Black public defenders and Black defense attorneys, you cannot continue to do things that are safe and easy. No way. I mean, we think about Thurgood Marshall going out here taking some of these defense cases, running from a lynch mob. And today, many of us that engage in public defense, whether it's defense of the public, whether it's as a private attorney, court appointed, or as a public defender, we're afraid of losing our jobs. We're afraid of having a bad reputation with the bar. Thurgood Marshall was running from a lynch mob, right? So I think that like sometimes you have to really begin to think about the work that we're doing might be important, might be really serious risk to us right now, but where is this in the genealogy of folks that have been doing this work? Where do your risks stand? Where's the relation in it? And finally, I would say with all of this, it all goes back to that beginning conversation I was having about being a good witness, right? And what skill set do you have in the law to do the work that you need to do? Maybe you're not equipped to be a prosecutor because you can't take it. I know when I went through the public defender service in DC and I went down into the court and I saw all those Black men and under the court in that fence, in that cage, that was too much for me. I can't see that every day. And maybe you need to be a public defender, or maybe you need to be an advocate on the outside, really changing the language and the understanding of the law. But in short, you have to get in where you fit in, right? And do that the best of your ability. And whenever you start to feel a little bit safe, a little bit comfortable, you probably need to expand a bit.
So yes, I love that. I love the idea of the abolitionist prosecutor, because I think people don't understand the abolition as a politic, as a process. It is, so what role do we take in that? And someone mentioned Rachel Rollins, who I grew up with, as an example. About, and that's a perfect example, right? What does it mean to have that kind of moral imagination? And I also love this point that you made about the relation. And I think this is especially important because now that being a PD is a high status profession, right? Like, so I grew up with movement lawyers who were sometimes PD. That was not a high status profession back then, but now it is. So there's risk attached to it. And the calculation of one's risk in one's profession is a constant question we have to ask ourselves about, right? Where are my values in relationship to my my desire to hold on, to have something? I love that line of thought. I think it's
I just want to think about that too, to your point, Imani, like our relationship to capital.
Yes.
Like our understanding that racial capitalism is not just a problem for white people. We Black people, we recreate this every day, and we maintain it. When we go to law school, we say, I went to law school because I want to get a high paying job. There's no critique with when to leave the rural country or the hood like me. Been there, not going back, don't plan on it, but not to live at least. But there's also this understanding that, like, if you're going to attain and acquire the benefits of racial capitalism, you have to question yourself. Because again, Thurgood Marshall, Pauli Murray, Charles Hamilton Houston, the people we quote and say, these are who we look up to, weren't here to get rich.
No.
He was here so their grandkids didn't die, right?
Yeah.
Under conditions. And like, so why are you going? What does it mean when Charles Hamilton Houston says that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society? Which one are you? And I think that's something we have to ask ourselves, not just daily, but throughout the day.
And I love those examples, because those examples also hit to me on another piece, and Baldwin does too, of this whole puzzle. Because I see, people will refer to Pauli Murray as a radical. Pauli Murray was a militant integrationist.
Yes.
Murray did not want to be called Black; she wanted to be called Negro.
That's right.
Or I should say they, because and I think because of Pauli Murray's being non-binary, there's an assumption that there's this whole larger politic, and also because of Pauli Murray's courage, right? And moral witnessing, there's an assumption of a politic. But the thing that we have to keep in mind is everybody might not be in the same political place, but if they are willing, same with Marshall, they are willing, right, to be committed, right, to the larger struggles for everybody who is marginalized in some way or another. That's part of, because right now we're very quick to cancel people's, not in the right wing, I'm not saying the right wing way, but cancel people's, reject them because of their political perspective. But at the end of the day, it's like, who's going to be there for the struggle?
That's right.
And a lot of those folks, Charles Hamilton, Houston too, they were in conflict with foot soldiers of the movement, right?
That's right.
That actually,
but yeah, so go ahead. Yeah, but
sorry, that actually leads me to another question. The question says, do you believe that getting more people of color, Black people, into politics would further or lessen the growth of a true equal America? And when you talk about, Dr. Perry, when you talk about this being a puzzle, I'm like, is it a political puzzle? Is it a cultural puzzle? Like what, like it's a puzzle within a puzzle? Like, do we think politics is the answer? Do we think that it's a cultural thing? Do we think it's a race thing?
Do you want to answer that first?
I'm gonna be more impolite than I know Imani is gonna be. I'm gonna say it's not a puzzle. I'm gonna say it's a shit show. Uh, it's a devil's bargain. Because listen, I'm not a person who believes in representation. And when I do believe in representation, I mean it with the etymology of the word, to be represented, right? The essence of you being presented again, not perverted, right? Not some fake, carbon copy thing going on. Because when you think about a solution as politics, I think about Tim Scott. What? Wake it up. What are we talking about? I think about Clarence Thomas. You set the movement back, baby. Like, you can't just have any old Black person in politics, and no shade, but more often than not, Congressional Black Caucus, I try to do some good things now, but more often than not, the Black people that attain political power are the ones that then arrest the futures of the Black poor. I can tell you, for most of my little short life, the biggest problems that I have had looking at politics, looking at what politics get created, are the compromises made by the Black elite. Right. So when you think about this idea with Hillary Clinton in the early 1990s, calling Black kids super predators, I was 7 years old. I remember watching that on TV. Right. But who was right behind her was the CBC. So I don't know and I don't understand that more Black people being in politics is an answer. I think it creates an interesting representational thing where we kind of put Black people in commercials for corporate, tobacco or something. We all get cancer now. We're smoking Virginia Slims or menthols. I think that's the kind of thing that's happening. But I think that more Black people with a Black politic, and not this idea that we're all agreeing, right, this monolithic way, but a Black politic that calls for a love of Black people, no matter how you think about getting there, can be part of our quiver of tools, right? Part of our solution. But politics in and of itself cannot be a solution because we're 11% of the country and dwindling. And when you're in a racial democracy like this, the 11%'s life is always, in the words of Derek Bell, going to depend, right, on the majority's bend in their will and their interest. So I don't know that politics in and of itself, well, actually, I would say that Black people in politics in and of itself is just a recipe for deep disappointment and harm, particularly to the Black poor, particularly for the Black poor that live in urban and rural areas.
So I agree with that in part. I don't believe in representation as image. I do believe in representation as accountability.
There you go.
I believe in the idea, the philosophy of political representation, that our political representatives should be accountable to communities. They are not, by and large, at the national level, right? For federal elections, they are not. They are not because they are primarily, and this is part of what shapes when the CBC does bad things, like when they had a bad position on net neutrality, part of it is because their constituency, so often, given the way US politics work, is corporations. Those are the people who fund them, who keep them afloat. I think it's important to remember Black people in Congress, unlike white people in Congress, are not wealthy people by and large. So, and they don't get the same jobs when they leave Congress, right? You don't see a lot of Black Congress people going to become of counsel at major corporate law firms, right? So they depend upon those corporations to sustain their middle class position and those jobs being able to keep them, right? It's part of the absence of boldness in the CBC, right? It's also the case that there's a lot of Black people who want to go into major electoral office because of bad values. Like, I don't want to sort of say they're just constrained, but we're not there. We don't have a structure of political accountability, except on the local level. And I do think that electoral politics on the local level continue to be important. I think in terms of sort of, basic access issues, I think, in terms of things like knowing how to, local officials can help with things like kids getting their shots, right? Being able to enroll in school, having papers. I think one of the things we talk about it with undocumented people, but we don't talk about with Black folks, how often Black folks don't have papers, don't have that you need to do basic things like Social Security cards, birth certificates, things like that. So those things matter for people's day-to-day lives, but I do think it is an absolute fiction to have this romantic account that Black people, Black faces in high places is transformative for Black people. It's not, right? And I think to go further, it can be destructive because part of as Black communities, the seduction of seeing Black, it feels good to see Black people do big things, is that we can vote against our interests and not demand what ought to be demanded if the person is Black who's doing it. Right. So there's moments where we would be skeptical or critical if it was a non-Black politician that we let go. I mean, the number of times that, well, they can't do nothing because, white people are on them all the time. They can't do anything. Right. Like, I mean, the most, like, these people in these incredibly powerful positions can't do anything. I mean, it's just, what's the point then?
That's right. Yeah, I think I remember when Obama was elected, the first and then the second term, the inability to critique Obama on militarism, on the compromises that he made regarding Black living and dying, some of the really detrimental policies. It just was really amazing.
Policy. I mean, it's just like,
I mean, you can go down the list, right? Even with healthcare, people want to apply the Affordable Care Act, but you could have even at least got a public option. But you know what I mean? So couldn't say reparations, couldn't say Black until Trayvon was killed. And that the fact that it takes Black death, right, for a Black person to step up and then even then step back. Because
and it's also a very particular sort of Black death, right? I mean, it's also, right.
Yes. And then we can talk about diaspora with Obama too. There's a lot going on. But the point is, though, to me, that to your point, if a Black person is president and they say they can't, or we say they can't because of pressure, who's more powerful than the president, baby? Right. And then not only that, the disciplining that happens for the everyday Black person or even the elite Black scholar for critiquing, that Black, you don't want us to go anywhere. You don't know how to act. We don't do this in public. So it's interesting the ways in which we become, in other words, the law, right? And police each other for truth telling and for bearing witness to our own harm.
Right. And also, I mean, truth telling, and also it's so interesting, the ideological policing that comes in the sort of the liberal Black world. Right?
That's right.
When we are actually called to be sort of have an accommodation towards the right-wing Black folks, but on the left side of the spectrum, there's a lot of policing effort, and it's not. So the notion that, it should simply be okay to have a different perspective and to speak it, right? And the refusal to allow people to speak different perspectives actually says something about what's the subtext of the fear, right? Mm-hmm. Black people, because so much of our political life, as Paul Freimer says, is we're a captured electorate, right? Or as Adolph Reed used to write about custodial politics. Black people are just called out, right? I mean, but he was right about, right? He's a complicated joke, but he was right about just Black people are called up to do what they're supposed to do. Like very soon we'll hear how important it is for us to vote in midterms without any of the things that Black people have been raising over the past 2 years having been substantively addressed.
And I know you have more questions. I just want to say, though, I think it's so important to begin to think about this notion of freedom of speech in Black people. And not just, from the state and, the kind of constitutional fundamental right, but within Blackness, the intramural. I don't think, and I mean, I know people can disagree with me. There's a lot to disagree with here, and I don't even know if I 100% believe this myself. But I would say in this moment, I feel that one of the fundamental freedoms that were missing from enslaved people was the ability to speak freely.
Yeah.
Right. And that, to me personally, that is the thing now, beyond movement and other things, that is disciplined across the racial spectrum, regardless of where we are, regardless of what we believe, and particularly though, if we're critiquing, the left and the Black community, and oftentimes critiquing the left to do more, right? There's a type of disciplinary thing there that happens that is not only chilling, it's very, very violent, and I think it has not just a negative effect, but has a deleterious effect on the ability of the Black body politic to progress and say, okay, we wrestled with this thing, we dealt with it, and now we have a better truth going forward. Because truth is a matter of contention, right? And if you can really get into the tug of war of it, you can get a more pure truth. But if someone just has more people backing them and they're louder, that's not truth, that's domination.
Right. Woo. There you go. There you go.
The South jumped out of you again. Look, Imani, I see you.
So Dr. Perry, in response to one of the earlier questions about what Black legal professionals can do, you said that your opinion was not that popular, that we needed more Black prosecutors. And one of the questions that someone sent in was, isn't there an argument that the Black community would not be receptive of that? And I think I can personally echo some of those sentiments, and like we probably all can, but it's not a popular opinion, but it's also not a popular profession. If you're going to be a lawyer, it kind of feels like within the Black community, there's this expectation, more like a demand, that you be a certain thing, and being a prosecutor doesn't usually come into the picture.
I think that's absolutely right. But I also think that we have to be more critical then, right? If there's a critique of the prosecutor, then there also should be the critique of the corporate lawyer, who's arguably doing as much potential harm as a prosecutor, right? I mean, there's things that there are ways that we will critique that, like a specific job or a specific, I mean, it's similar to, and I am all on board always with critiquing Black Republicans, but the critique of the Black Republican, but not the critique of the Black Democrat, who is basically a Republican, right? Sometimes we do this sort of categorical thing. So there's that. But I mean, I guess, this question, it's such an interesting question about what communities want. And I think as an intellectual, it's a really interesting question, because there's a lot of, I will say very clearly, there's a lot of pressure as an academic or intellectual who's in the public sphere to say things that Black people want to hear, right? Because that's like it's a notion of representation, to represent, right? But the things that I think that we are called to do are not, we don't do things, to me, so that, for me, in loving Black folks, so that Black people will love me. I do things because I love Black people.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So the way I am moved is because of what my commitments are, not whether everybody is going to cheer when I say what I have to say.
That's right.
So that becomes a very, it's personal, but it's also, and you do still need accountability, right? You need people responding. You have to deal with the funkiness of people being like, you can't just say, okay, I'm going to put on blinders. When people came at me very hard for critiquing Obama, right? It was miserable. I still had to listen. I had a responsibility to listen. I just thought they were wrong. Right?
I love that. So another question that someone sent in is, how can we change the perception that the law is not here to help, but that the law hinders people of color?
Yeah, so I want to answer the last question before thinking about this. So I think it's one thing to have a categorical rejection of prosecutors and police and lawyers in general, but I think it's important to remember that all these people are officers of the law. And I think that if you're a Black person, particularly if you're a Black poor person, it's probably saved your life to be skeptical of every officer of the law, whether they're a lawyer or whether they're a police officer. And to Imani's point, if you go into these positions, they're going to be positions of privilege, and it behooves you to have tough skin. And not just tough skin, but to Imani's point, to operate in a position or a labor of love, right? Or what Christina Sharp calls care work, right? So you're doing this not so they love you, not so they give you praise, but because you actually care, right? And you're in a position of power to gift care continually over and over and over again. So I do think it's incumbent upon those people in those offices, and myself too, as a legal academic, right, to say, and not just to say, but to demonstrate, this is what I, me, Tia Nancy, can do. I'm not speaking for all lawyers because most of them are trash. I'm speaking for all police, officers of the law, because it's mostly trash and harmful. That's the way the system's built, right, from the Federalist Papers. But to answer your current question, what can we do to change the perception, either to or against, the law being harmful and being helpful, or the vice versa? I don't know that we need to change people's perceptions, because people's perceptions are based on their lived experiences. I'm not here to persuade anyone that their life is wrong. I am here to walk with you, talk with you, and understand that your future is not the same way, right? So my job, I would say, as someone who deals with law, maybe, definitely very, very skeptical of it, is to walk with you and talk with you and understand, how can we bend law, right, toward the rejuvenation and maintenance of Black living, as opposed to demands toward Black death and Black suffering. And so if you are a person who says, I'm skeptical of law is harmful, yada, 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 I know it is, Because look at black mothers and their children and maternity rates, right? Death rates of babies and mothers. Look at educational attainment. Look at the criminality and arrest and conviction rates. Look at these eyewitness misidentifications. Look at the ability to go to college, right? Look at Black believability on the stand. So there's not a body of evidence where you can tell me that the law has been anything other than harmful, even when it's being gracious or gratuitous. There's always a dose of poison there. So what I can do is say, baby, you right. So what have you seen? What are the loopholes? How can we move up? How can we maneuver in this thing? And how are we called the Houstonian method? How can we break the law so it lives, so it bends toward Black living? And so I think that is the question, not how do we convince, but how do we undo?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, right. And I like that because I don't think that the law is good. It is, right? It just is, right? Yep. These are the conditions we occupy. You know, I will say I don't believe in lawlessness, but I don't know what that looks like. So I can't say it would be worse, right? But I know what is, right? And I know, and I agree, you know, so then we work with what is, we imagine otherwise, we reach for something different, and yet we deal with the material conditions of our lives. But I think this is, I also really, I love the point about skepticism. And it made me think of a conversation I had with my son several years ago, because, you know, I was talking about how terrible policing is. And he said, well, there are good police officers. And I said, there are good people who are police officers.
There you go.
Being a police officer is not good because it is an institution that is predicated on criminalization, right? Like, so even when we think about, you know, what counts as crime is a choice, right? What we categorize as crime, right? The literally millions of actions that are treated as crimes, that is a matter of political ideological choice, right? So there's an action that's predicated on this construction of crime that I think is fundamentally inhumane, right? With the exception of violent actions, a large proportion of which are actually sort of manifestations of psychological wound, right? So once we actually think about what it means to criminalize, I can't think that, you know, punishing vulnerabilities is actually an ethical thing to do. But there are good people who choose to be police officers, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, this question of like framing is really important. I wanted to understand how the world worked, which is why I studied law and became a law professor. I didn't think of myself as a champion at any point of the law or the Constitution, right? But once you understand how things work and you want things to be different, and also we got to have jobs in this world, right? Like we got to work, right? And so then the question is, okay, well, where do we fit in, and what can we do that is good wherever we fit in?
Yeah, and I love that. And again, if you're going to choose to be a police officer, I think that if you do that, understanding what the world is and having a value that bends toward Black love and care work, go be one. Please. Like, I'd rather get stopped by you when I'm speeding down the highway. I ain't gonna say which one because I want to get caught up. But when I'm speeding down the highway, I'd rather it be you who understands. Maybe I was in a hurry and maybe I don't need my face pushed into the gravel, right? When I just got my hair done on this good day. Don't do that, right? But also, if you're going to be a Black police officer, if you're going to be a white police officer, anyone, you need to walk into that job understanding the systemic and institutional pressures, right? That lend back to a history from slave patrols, right? And punishment of the poor, and also understand the history of policing and prosecutors, when in many cases, or in most cases, have always already been in opposition to social progress. So what does it mean to join an institution that's always beat down every civil rights movement in the history of this country? You got to take that on and be honest about it and have a good old spine in spiritual practice. And maybe you're atheist. Maybe you just need to go home and eat some good soul food to get yourself strong. Whatever it is, you have to steel yourself for that and be honest.
So another really interesting question just came in, and I'm interested in what you both have to say. So this is from an anonymous person. What recommendations do you have for law professors in order to reduce white dominant culture in the law and in legal education?
Wait, can you repeat that, Ashlyn? I missed that last part.
What recommendations do you have for law professors in order to reduce white dominant culture in the law and in legal education? I
Okay.
have a lot to say, but I'm interested in what the scholars have to say.
Don't sell yourself. You're a scholar too. Don't play with me.
That's right. Gosh.
Yeah.
I mean, how much time? This is like a 4-hour conversation. I mean, there's so much. Law school culture it's interesting. I will say when I taught law school, I was like, this is the first time that I feel patriarchy intensely. Not just racism, but like the gender politic, the classroom dynamics, the logic of. So I remember starting law school, and I'd read my case, right? Read cases and go to court and learn that everything that was interesting and politically meaningful about the case was not important, right? Right, because the effort to create abstractions, the notion of a reasonable person standard, this notion that you can, that like cases are treated in like manner, even though the circumstances will be vastly different of the parties involved, right? Studying and then teaching William V. Walker Thomas Furniture Company and understanding what it actually means to not be able to afford furniture and be subject to exploitative market practice in everywhere in the community, right? Like, so, okay, well, this contract, you're going to say this is exploitative, but what about the whole conditions of living in this community, right? Like and that's the case for folks who don't know, it's a case about predatory lending and furniture sales, which, most of us, I think Black folks who had any connection to Black working class and poor life have dealt with these companies in one point or another. And if you read the case, you understand that they addressed an exploitative loan policy, but the case actually doesn't deal with the larger dynamic. So, I mean, every aspect of legal academic culture needs to be deconstructed.
That's right.
Every single one. And it is a patriarchal white supremacist structure for educating people. And then on top of it, the schools are often places that, are routinely insulting and diminishing large portion of the population. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, when I first got here, I taught this class, Black Lives Matter, Retracing the Black and Black Letter Law. And I always tell my students that the law is not just Black letter law. There are Black lives that are subdued under this text. Oftentimes, Black blood is the ink that binds together not only the Constitution, but its precedents, right, within the Federalist Papers and the Magna Carta and all these things. And so I think that our first duty when we're thinking about the law is to think about, where's the lie? Here's the holding. Here's what you said. Here's the rule, but where is the lie? And the lie is oftentimes, to Imani's point, the stories and the lives that are obscured, that are perverted, because when you read a Supreme Court case, you do not get the briefings, right, from the individuals. You don't know the race of people. You don't know their sexuality. You think.
But sometimes you do, right? But you're not supposed to talk. Yes, right.
Yeah, but you think you know their gender, okay? You think you know.
Right.
Don't know, right? We assume that's ascribed. And so I think when you think about the law, it's just so interesting because every step that you go through, you talk about the reasonable person, we can talk about what it means to be in a high crime neighborhood, and then all of your Fourth Amendment rights disappear. High crime means I live around a bunch of poor Black people. And it only means that there are more police here surveilling us. So more crime is detected because you're intent on not only detecting crime, but sometimes inventing it. Or you're getting a bonus or a raise, what have you, based upon how many traffic tickets you give in this area, looking at Ferguson and St. Louis, right? And I always tell the story about Lawrence versus Texas. Lawrence versus Texas is always taught about as this kind of landmark LGBT civil rights case. And I will challenge all of you, and maybe this is controversial, but I will say almost every case in Supreme Court history where a civil rights advance, a Black person is harmed. In this case, Tyrone Gardner, who we don't hear about, right, is at a house with his former partner, with a friend that the partner is jealous about. What does he do? He calls the police and says there's a Black man breaking into an apartment. So the whole reason that they come into contact with Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Gardner, is because there's a Black deranged man waving a gun on the loose. So anti-Blackness becomes the portal through which, right, same-sex consensual sexual relations are allowed. What does that begin to mean? That civil rights oftentimes come through a Black sacrificial bloodletting, right? Or a type of legal lynching, not in the way that Clarence Thomas We'll talk about your excuse as sexual assault, but the ways in which progress itself oftentimes requires or demands temporary progress, mostly all progress is usually temporary for us, but it requires or demands a Black blood sacrifice.
Yes.
That's the law. That's precedent. And so I always try to tell folks, you have to think about not just precedents and like the decisions that were rendered, but precedents of anti-Blackness and how they collude, collide, and cohere with what the court says is just and moral.
So I've heard professors refer to having a bravery to be able to address these kinds of topics, but I don't think that's what it is. So I'm interested to know what you guys think that white law professors need to do to address what we just talked about. Is it bravery or is it something else?
I just want to say something before you speak, Imani, because I want you to come to this. You talk in your book so much about John Brown and others, right? And you talk about kind of these white abolitionists that one, end up being lynched and killed and sometimes burned, right? And have all these types of things. And I think that sometimes white law professors are so worried about offending their colleagues,
yes,
about breaking the tradition. Well, that's not the process we've always had. And well, if we do this differently in this moment, then what does that mean? Well, I came through this way and we've always taught the law. What if you don't get a job? What if you feel bad about, what if Black people feel bad about themselves because we've changed these admission standards or we've changed the bar exam, right? But you have white people that you spoke about in your book in Appalachia, right? That are willing to not only break away from Virginia, but also risk their lives in service of what their idea of a type of founding is. Yet we have law professors that are afraid to ruffle the feathers there, afraid to not get a promotion, afraid to lose a friendship, or really afraid, and this is not necessarily particular to this school, but the upper Midwest in general, afraid to ruffle feathers. That's not something we say out loud. I don't want to be disagreeable, right? So those historical things, the historical kind of disjuncture is something that kind of jumped out of me when reading your book, and particularly those sections on the kind of white abolitionists.
Thank you.
And where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these questions that is hard because of the way talk about race and is framed today, right? Because there's we have a discourse that is like, how can white people be better? Right, to correct, and so much of it is about performance, right? How can white people act better, right? Yes. And I think the point that you made, which is so important, whiteness is disciplined, right? So when white people do not behave according to the logic of the dominant racial paradigm, they are disciplined for it, right? Pushed out. I mean, it's part of the reason why I talk about Elvis, even though Elvis is problematic, but that like, he couldn't go on the opera. They were like, he is too much like a Black person, yeah. Right? Moves to, and he had and claimed Black mentorship and all this kind of like, and that's just a sort of, that's a small example in comparison to someone like John Brown who is killed. And it's not, and also it doesn't mean John Brown was heroic. John Brown also had issues that he needed to work through with in terms of his racial politics, even though he gave his life, to end slavery. But I think it is like, the question is, what kind of person are you, right? Are you someone who is invested in the mythology of the nation and the law? Or are you interested in being a truth teller? Are you interested in being a person who gives law students the tools to actually engage in transformation or not, right? Yeah. And I'm telling you, because I know people who I work with and who have learned the lesson about what they're supposed to say and what they're not supposed to say and what they're supposed to add to their curriculum. But that transformation in terms of what kind of person you want to be has not taken place.
So what I hear you saying is like whiteness itself, and not as in like you're born a white person, not that type of whiteness, but whiteness as an ideology, as a construct, is a surround of discipline. And it not only entraps Black people of color, non-Black people of color, of course, Indigenous people as well, but it disciplines white people in maintaining the social order and disorder. And so the call then, I guess, in my opinion, in hearing what you said, is not for white people to be better white people. It's for white people to step beyond whiteness and to step into a type of humanity and a type of care work. Right. So like if whiteness has discipline, called, pressured, beaten you into doing, incentivized, right, and doing X, Y, Z, what does it mean to step out of that? Right. What does it mean to just look at yourself as the human right? Outside of this construct and the ways in which many of us queer folk have kind of stepped into, or rather stepped outside of gender. Right. And say, actually, I don't want no gender. Girl, you can have it. It's a burning house.
Right. No, I mean, this is Noel Ignatieff, who wrote the book How the Irish Became White, who I grew up with, like an uncle to me. He used to say, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. Now, I'm not, that language, I'm not opposed to the language, but the language can be such that because people can't imagine their way out of their categories, we don't have to use that language. But I think it's simply like to not let what you were supposed to be as a white person, what you've been messaged as, limit your moral imagination. Like, that's what it is to me.
No, we're not saying be Dillas or Dolezal now. Don't go be Rachel. Actually did a good NAACP work. You don't need the perm though to do this work.
Because in some ways that's abdicating responsibility. I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm not white anymore. Like, that actually is not right. But on the other hand, I will say this, since she brought her up, and I'm gonna say stuff, since we saying unpopular stuff today, since you brought her up.
I mean, you know me.
Rachel Dolezal, that should have stayed a local story. She's a person who is clearly distressed.
Yeah.
She has psychological and emotional challenges. The other cases where people are actually becoming, people of color strategically to gain some access and jobs, that's a different matter. But for her, I just was like, she's not, there's something that's not right there. And I just thought, like, there's a lot of other stuff, ways that we are oppressed, that I think are much more interesting to talk about.
Well, I told you I'm working on this article on white people of color and how people transition into and out of people of color identities in order to both gain incentives, privilege, power, and economic wherewithal, right, and political echoes and magnitude, but also to discipline other people of color into acting in a particular type of way, but then step out when white folks get out of line to do these tiers and things like that. And so that's something interesting, but also last comment on Rachel Dolezal, I do think that like there's something obviously in distress about them, but I think if you take seriously that you're someone who's deeply involved in the NAACP, you're reading all this history of like white violence and white terror, and that's been your identity, how do you not go crazy? I go crazy oftentimes when I think about people that are assigned male at birth and the particular type of violence that men have done to other queer people, to women, people that don't identify with gender at all, just through space and time. Like, what do you want to be, a man? Sheesh.
Right.
Right. And so I think about that. Like, what happens when that collapses?
Yeah. Well, it clearly, and I mean, I hate the sort of armchair psychoanalyzing, but I'm about to do it because I do think also witnessing the abuse of her Black siblings was a piece of that, right? Like this, I want to be white here. And that's, whatever, but it's not a defense of her. It's just, that's a personal problem. In my, like I don't, but what you're saying, I just have to say really quickly, because I remember back when when I was in school, you could have like race scholarships that are now like all gone. But we'd have these interviews for things, and all of a sudden, all these people would be around who I didn't know were people of color, like in the interview suite, right? And I'd be like, wait, you, right? And there is this question of the very narrow forms of affirmative action or opportunities that exist that are supposed to do the most modest remediation, right? And who gets those spots? Right. And that's not a question. It's not a real remediation anyway. But if those spots go to people who are privileged solely to people privileged by class, by color, by proximity to whiteness, that is something that we need to talk about.
When we do, because if we think about, I mean, from Thurgood Marshall on to Kamala and Barack Obama, the type of Black people besides Ketanji that enter into these positions of power, they're all either light-skinned Black people or they're not African-American at all. And, they're African or mixed or what have you. And not to say that Black African-Americans are not mixed, to say that your father's
like a parent.
You don't have that genealogy of slavery. And what does that begin to mean? Or free people in the United States. And so that privilege is something we have to interrogate. And so I think it's just something very, very uncomfortable for folks. So we got to wrestle with it. That's what we have to do. That's our jobs. But to your point, though, and I'll shut up after this point, but to your point, you talked again about the book about Black people that had pale skin, right? And blue eyes, but they were known to be Black in that moment. So we're also not saying that you can't be a light skin, pale skin. I have cousins with blonde hair afros, right? And not be Black. But we are saying it's something curious when you're raised and inculcated rather, or enculturated in a space that is not Black or non-Black people of color at all, and you show up at admissions and now you're a person of color. There's something going on here.
Right. And I think the thing is, it has to do with our politics, right? Because everybody is seeking every form of possible advantage that is sort of, there's something depoliticized that's happening there. Mm-hmm. And it also has to do with a satisfaction on a certain level of a very modest remediation, right? So it's like, I remember Bob Moses talking about that movie Waiting for Superman, which is about families competing to get into a charter school. And it's like it's a winners and losers like situation, right? Who gets into the families, who doesn't? And he said, okay, you could look at that movie and you could say, okay, well, these people won the lottery. You could say everybody in that room could figure out how to work together to get all their kids a great education. Mm-hmm. And then his politics as someone, as a member of SNCC and Organized Freedom Summer, is the latter, right? How do you organize yourself? Like, what would it mean to give a whole community good education as opposed to picking and choosing the superstars at a given school, which tends to privilege kids of a particular sort?
Rejection of the rugged individualism, though, is oftentimes a rejection of what our underlying notion of patriotism is. And so I think that is so hard, because you have to reject the kind of hegemonic origin story of the nation,
Dr. Perry, speaking of your book, there are a few questions about your book, and we are coming up on the time. So this question says, what role should the unique history and culture of the South play in how we think about the law and how the law should respond to the challenges of today?
I mean, I think the simple thing is that you look to the history and you understand the mythology, right? I mean, so it's one of the places where it's most transparent, right? That the conceptions like, procedure are so often not actually safeguards. I mean, every time there's this sort of these horrible incidences of state violence against Black people. And then we have a leadership class that tells us, well, don't protest too much, just wait for them to be charged and and then everybody waits with bated breath for the procedure. And then more often than not, the procedure fails. But what the procedure has done is disciplined people, right? And it's demobilized. Well, part of what the history of the South teaches you, especially around race, is that procedural safeguards should not be trusted, right? Like, in fact, as Douglas said, and now that I understand Maryland is part of the South, I cite Douglas even more, that, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? And so you cannot, and the law is not a fixed institution, right? As much, whatever stare decisis and all that notwithstanding, it moves in response to demand. So, I think I would say that's the primary lesson. Yeah.
One of the questions I had about your book is that your book discusses the influence that the South has on our global community and how it's influenced the United States as we know it. So what are some of the positive and some of the negative influences that Southern history has on the law?
It's hard to think in terms of positive. I think in terms of what we understand, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, I'll give just a quick example. When people talk about undocumented immigration from Central America, part of the reason I wrote my book the way I did, where I talk about how Central American economies were essentially built by anti-democratic forces of businessmen in the South, right? So that, businessmen in New Orleans actually staging coups, right, in Central America shapes why going there is why people are here it's regionally specific, because the notion of essentially making an entire populace without rights and the service of your industry is how the South was built, right? So when you say, okay, wait, we can make a lot of money off bananas, so we'll just make it so that they can't really vote. Well, that cotton, that's what they do with cotton, that's what they do with sugar, sort of like so the lesson is, I think there are ways of doing that we should not separate out because of borders. We should understand that these ways of doing traveled. Similarly with so much of what has happened in the Middle East is shaped by the history of Texas and the desire to sustain profits through the oil industry in Texas has shaped US foreign policy in some of the most terrible ways internationally. So when we get why decisions are made underneath the narratives about democracy and stability and actually what interests were at stake, I think we can become better global people, right? And I wouldn't even say citizens, but people who exist in the world. And I will say, though, that the positive or the lesson is that there are incredible examples in the Black freedom movement of people who thought through this entire matrix. And if we get beyond the national narrative of the movement, we can actually see, right? It's not incidental that most of the Black people who fled to Cuba who fled to Cuba because they were under, threat from the US government were Southerners. That's not incidental. That has to do with a politic that developed because of witnessing how things were done.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm just trying to filter through the Q&A and the chat.
I just think it's really interesting too, because like there's the way Ashley framed about the positive and negative, I think is interesting. But then to think about like, the Ella Bakers and others, right, that are living under the conditions, right, of the same regimes or the same type of regimes from the South to the Middle East to South and Central America. And what lessons do we take from there? Right. And when you look at so many of the kind of freedom fighters in Brazil and throughout Central America and other places, you can see the genealogy so clearly. And so in some ways there is South to America, but there's also, North to America too, if you're thinking about through the global South. And what does that begin to mean to resist these kind of politics of extraction and domination?
Well, see, this is actually why it's called South to America as opposed to South to the United States. Or that it is because it is understanding the US South is actually a part of the global South, which is a term, and I read about in the book, that is a metaphor where the global politics are described metaphorically, the person who coined the term, through the language of the US South. And it's also the case that those places were deeply connected, right? See, even for me, I say, okay, well, for example, with 1619, we could start there. We could also start in 1492 because the ideology that undergirded the project, right, and these European powers fighting for control, dominion over this land and wanting to take the abundance and harness it and exploit anybody that came in their wake or kill them, right, in order to get all this wealth, that starts earlier, right? It's the stage. So I think you're absolutely right. And this is also why even the way we talk about Ella Baker, and I'm so glad you mentioned as an example, because Ella Baker talked about Central America. She talked about Puerto Rico. We just excised that from the movement history.
That's right. Or Stokely Carmichael in Palestine. Like, or Malcolm X in Palestine, or Alice Walker. So I think that is just so interesting. Like, what is it? I mean, Christina talked about memory for forgetfulness. What does that begin to kind of look at? And I'm thinking about your text and conversation with Lisa Lowe's intimacies of the continents, right? And like thinking about what's happening with India and Africa, all in the kind of wake of these global continents being subsumed, in particular types of ways, because resistance is real, right? Through the kind of hunger of commodification of Europe.
All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. So I'll go through one of the last questions that someone asked upon registration, and they just put it in the chat too. Okay, so, and I think Dr. Perry, this is about your book. I'm assuming that it is. So when writing important treatments like this, and I assume that it was about South to America around place and culture, we're often asked to kill our darlings or cut things we find central and significant. What are some of the stories from your book that were precious to you that did not make the final edit?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, today I was talking to, and I have to get off briefly because I have another event that is a book event. But well, I'll say a couple. I had to cut out the Arkansas chapter. I had to cut out details of certain stories. So there's a section where we talk about Huntsville, and I talk about Oakwood University, and the point is which is an Adventist university, and I uncover that there were actually organizers on Oakwood, which is seen as a sort of incredibly conservative institution, but it is so conservative because the organizing tradition was squashed. But there's a lot more in that section. I talk about Arna Bontemps, who is a Harlem Renaissance writer, working there, but not his story, right? And his story of coming from Louisiana, migrating to California, and his father, who was super respectable, and his uncle, who was super not respectable, both saying they wished they could still be in the South, even though, and he was like, I couldn't figure it. So he goes to Alabama in part to figure that out, right? And so there's moments like that where when I'm tracing an intellectual genealogy, and Arna Bontemps so he's from Louisiana. He taught it in Alabama. He sort of got pushed out there, went to Chicago, said, this is just as racist as Alabama, and then went to Nashville and settled. And then years later, he's my mother's professor. And so there's like that whole genealogy that is central to me to understand, because I'm really interested in Black intellectual genealogies in struggle, right? Like a lot of the book is a movement history, but it is a movement history that is about people thinking about how to get free in all these different kind of spaces and being so intimately connected with each other. A lot of those stories, it was just too much. So that Arkansas, Houston had a chapter that I said I had to take. I had all this stuff to say about Oklahoma and also St. Louis, about what is the Midwest South, like how do you parse that? There's just a ton of stuff. I mean, the book could have been twice as long. Yeah.
Yes. Well,
thanks
Imani,
for that question.
I know you have to go in a moment. So first, I just want to thank Ashlyn for taking the time to moderate. I know you're about to graduate. You're about to be doing finals. You living your best life. So thank you for the brilliance of your questions and constructing these. Imani, thank you for your time and for this dope book that now has rearranged my next book. You always do this to me. I can't write nothing because you always write something. And really just thank you for the generosity of your intellect. And I put links to Imani's book, but also the new Center for the Study of Black Life and the Law. Check it out. Definitely donate if you with it. We need to raise some funds. Imani, are there ways people can contact you or find your work? I
mean, it's easy to find me on Twitter. And, the African American Studies at Princeton faculty page. Also, I want to tell you congratulations on your award on the center. And also, there is so much. The very first regional project I ever wanted to do, people don't know this, was about the Black Midwest. And so I am charging you with that work.
Well, I'm home. I'm back.
Thank y'all so much for being here too, everybody who's here.
Thank you all for attending. If you have follow-up questions, don't be afraid to hit me up. And we're looking forward to talking with you guys soon as the new series on Black Life and the Law continues in the fall. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Perry.
Thank you.